Who was Nicus Poulantzas?
Nicus Poulantzas, 1936–1979, developed a nuanced Marxist analysis of social class in late capitalist systems. Building on Antonio Gramsci, 1891–1937, he argued that elements of the ruling class have made strategic alliances with oppressed classes and successfully secured their ongoing consent, such as with the American New Deal instituted by President Franklin Roosevelt. Poulantzas' major works include Political Power and Social Classes, 1968. Classes in Contemporary Capitalism, 1973, and State, Power, Socialism, 1978.
Who was Søren Kierkegaard?
Søren Abe Kierkegaard, 1813–1855, was a Danish Christian existentialist who extolled religious faith as an individual and emotional leap from all that was reasonable and rational. He wrote from his heart and the emotional circumstances of his own life.
What is Catherine MacKinnon's contribution to second-wave feminist political philosophy?
In the 1970s, Catherine MacKinnon, 1946, began to argue that sexual harassment is a form of sexual discrimination, outlawed by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin also developed legal theory to outlaw pornography. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against sexual harassment in 1986, largely based on MacKinnon's work. And the Supreme Court of Canada has partly accepted her arguments against pornography. MacKinnon's books include, In Harm's Way, The Pornography Civil Rights Hearings. Edited and introduced with Andrea Dworkin, 1997, Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, 1989. Pornography and Civil Rights, A New Day for Women's Equality, with Andrea Dworkin, 1988. Organizing Against Pornography, 1988, Feminism Unmodified, Discourses on Life and Law, 1987. And Sexual Harassment of Working Women, A Case of Sex Discrimination, with Thomas I. Emerson, 1979.
How do the Chichlans account for perceptions of meaning?
Meaning is fixed by networks of association. Ultimately, meaning will be replaced by connectionist networks with activation along preferred vectors. Sameness of meaning is no more than a sameness of patterns. In the library of the future, there will be plugs for directly activating relevant brain states and patterns, bypassing the need to transmit meanings via language as we now know it.
Why was the single status of early modern men of science and philosophy important?
Inevitably, bachelorhood would have had the negative effect of not having long-term intimate relationships or much experience with children and family life in adulthood. A bachelor's style of life would have then supported a view of the world from the perspective of a lone individual, and an assumption that the philosophical mind would always have the same gender as oneself.
Why did philosophy start in ancient Greece?
The ancient Greeks had a broad democratic cultural tradition that encouraged individual independence of mind, the questioning of authority, and disagreement among peers. The seafaring, trading, and warring nature of the ancient Greeks was conducive to the development of intellectual cosmopolitanism among the privileged classes in this slave-owning society. From the pre-Socratics on, Greek philosophers were not merely thinkers, but also men of action, capable of leadership and civic involvement. Moreover, the Greeks were warlike and valued the virtues of combat, such as courage and honor. When it came to polite interaction, they did not hesitate to voice disagreement, a trait conducive to philosophical debate, as well.
What are the three waves of feminism according to feminist philosophers?
The first wave began on the eve of the French Revolution with Mary Wollstonecraft's 1759 to 1797 writings and continued until women in both Great Britain and the United States were granted the right to vote in 1918 and 1920, respectively. After women gained suffrage in the United States, the women's movement seemed to go into a dormant period, perhaps because until the end of World War II progressive thought was concentrated on socialism and communism. However, in the middle of the 20th century, the publication of two books began what many view as the second wave. The French existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir's 1908 to 1986, The Second Sex, 1952, and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963. Betty Friedan, 1921 to 2006, was an American writer and left-wing political journalist and activist. In 1957, at the 15-year reunion of Smith College, an institution for women, she interviewed her classmates who had graduated in 1942. Many had achieved the approved social ambition of a husband, home, and children, but they were dissatisfied with their lives and in some instances agonizingly unfulfilled. Friedan argued, in ways that resonated throughout American society and Europe, that women as human beings needed education and meaningful work, mental stimulation, and fully adult responsibilities. By the 1970s, further development of Friedan's ideas found expression in the third wave, the women's liberation movement was associated with the following achievements. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in employment on the grounds of gender, as well as race. The U.S. Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973 legitimized the right to abortion based on bodily privacy. These legal innovations combined with the pill, birth control medication, provided a new degree of sexual freedom. Huge increases in women's employment outside the home, and access to higher education. Women entered the professions in unprecedented numbers, and the rest is history in the sense that it is now taken for granted by American society that women should have opportunities equal to men's.
What is philosophy of technology?
Ideas of technology go back to Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, who spoke of techne, or knowledge of art and craft, which included arithmetic and medicine. Such knowledge understands itself, according to universals and causes. It can be taught and is distinct from physis, or nature. Contemporary philosophy of technology is a multidisciplinary field dedicated to studying the cultural effects and causes of technology, both historically and in its emergent forms. The American Philosophical Association publishes a newsletter on philosophy and computers, and there are academic journals such as Ends and Means, Net Future Technology and Human Responsibility, and Techne, Research in Philosophy and Technology.
How did skepticism further arguments for faith and mysticism?
When there were contending religions, each side would apply skepticism to the knowledge claims of the other. The Catholics used skepticism to disprove the claims about knowledge of God made by the Protestants. And the Protestants did the same thing to the Catholics. The result was that each side ended up extolling its own type of faith, rather than the knowledge claimed by the other side. This use of skepticism to elevate faith and mysticism had its roots in Islamic philosophy, specifically in the writings of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali 1058-1111. As the two-sided religious skeptical debates wore down, the modern form of skepticism, which supports observation and the scientific method, came into wide use.
What was impressive about Averroes' life and work?
Averroes, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born into a prominent family of lawyers and judges, and was himself trained as a lawyer in both civil and religious affairs. He traveled from Córdoba to Marrakesh in 1153 and decided that Aristotle had been correct in stating that the world was round when he was able to observe Canope, a star not visible in Spain. He served as both advisor and doctor to the Sultan of Marrakesh, who encouraged a series of commentaries on Aristotle. His writings include treatises on medicine and astronomy, but he is best known for his The Incoherence of Incoherence, which was a reply to Al-Ghazali's, 1058-1111, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In his Incoherence of Incoherence, Averroes defended natural reason as a means to attain knowledge in all domains. By natural reason Averroes, and others after him, meant ordinary thought processes rather than religious intuition or revelation. Averroes also wrote a set of commentaries on Aristotle that was influential in Western medieval scholarship. When his interpretations of Aristotle did not square with his own assumptions, he wrote detailed supplements of his own. For example, Aristotle's Physics and On the Heavens were composed as two separate works and based on different types of observations. Under Plato's influence, Averroes assumed that they were united.
What were Herbert Spencer's ideas about evolution?
Spencer believed that change occurs according to the law of evolution, which dictates a progression from simplicity to homogeneity to uniformity to more complexity to heterogeneity to variety. At any stage, all of the parts that are changing are also part of one whole. Spencer cited as evidence examples from the physical, biological, psychological, and social sciences. Society itself evolves from primitive homogeneous forms to complex advanced ones. He pointed out, whereby component parts have different functions. Because Spencer thought that change follows its own internal rules. He believed that social progress cannot be the result of external actions, such as social welfare or the regulation of trade. In education, he believed that children should be taught skills that would best enable them to compete with others. Spencer's views were taken up by social Darwinists, who advocated the principles of the survival of the fittest for society, against social reform generally, and in favor of capitalistic competition, specifically.
Why wasn't Charles Peirce ever a professor of philosophy?
Peirce did have a job as lecturer in logic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, from 1879 to 1891. But in 1883 he divorced Harriet Melusina Fay, to whom he had been married since 1862, and married Juliette Froissy. Froissy was thought to be a gypsy, and Peirce was said to have lived with her before their marriage. A scandal ensued, and Peirce left his academic position. Peirce's only subsequent employment was for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, which ended in 1901 due to congressional curtailment of funding. Peirce then did odd jobs and was employed as a consultant in chemical engineering. Sometimes, William James, 1842 to 1910, and other friends assisted him financially.
What were the goals of activist second-wave feminists?
equality with men in employment, an end to violence against women, full equality of women in public life, including access to the highest offices of government, and top executive positions in all social institutions, were all goals of the second wave. Full acceptance of lesbians and non-traditional families remain ongoing political ideals, as do universal health care and child care for working mothers in the United States. The problem of the second shift, or the fact that working women still do disproportionate amounts of domestic work and child care in their homes, is another overhanging problem. See In the Second Shift 1990 by Arlie Russell Hochschild and N. Machen.
What is philosophy for children?
Philosophy for children is an attempt both to introduce critical thinking and the subject of philosophy to high school students, and to explore and develop natural interest in philosophical questions among younger children. In Europe, high school age students have traditionally had at least some philosophy on their curricula. The question in the United States is not whether teenagers are capable of learning philosophy, but how to introduce it and find teachers qualified to do so, as well as funding. While psychologist Jean Piaget set the paradigm that children are not able to think about thinking or engage in philosophy before about age 12, philosopher Gareth Matthews, 1929, argues in Philosophy and the Young Child, 1980, that there was evidence of philosophical thought and speech in Piaget's own young subjects. Before then, Matthew Lipman, 1922, had introduced philosophy to middle school children in Montclair, New Jersey, with his 96-page philosophical novel for children, Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, 1974. A philosophical novel for children is a story that raises philosophical issues in language that a child can understand. Both Matthews and Lipman have stressed the active nature of children's philosophical interests. By contrast, Norwegian author Jostein Gaarder's best-selling young adult novel Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy, 1994, leads the reader through a series of studies about philosophy. Thus, philosophy for teenagers may be more didactic than the philosophy already taught to children. Contemporary journals devoted to teaching children philosophy include Analytic Teaching, the Community of Inquiry Journal, Critical and Creative Thinking, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy for Children. Questions, Philosophy for Young People, and Thinking, the Journal of Philosophy for Children.
What were some examples of Montaigne's famous wit?
Montaigne had sayings from Sextus Empiricus, 160 to 210 c. E. carved into the beams of the rafters of his study. His favorite, which became his own motto and the motto of the essays, was Que sais je, or What do I know? The following aphorisms are excerpts from his essays. Wise men have more to learn of fools than fools of wise men. From the same sheet of paper on which a judge writes his sentence against an adulterer, he tears off a piece to scribble a love note to his colleague's wife. Don't discuss yourself, for you are bound to lose, if you belittle yourself. You are believed, and if you praise yourself, you are disbelieved. Even on the most exalted throne in the world we are only sitting on our own ass. Fashion is the science of appearances, and it inspires one with the desire to seem rather than to be. He who is not strong in memory should not meddle with lying. I will fight the right side to the fire, but excluding the fire if I can. There are some defeats more triumphant than victories. Age prints more wrinkles in the mind than it does in the face, and souls are never, or very rarely seen, that in growing old do not smell sour and musty. Books are a languid pleasure. Even in the midst of compassion we feel within I know not what tart sweet. Titillation of malicious pleasure in seeing others suffer, children have the same feeling. Few men are admired by their servants. The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself.
What are the pitfalls and promises of experimental philosophy?
In its degenerate forms, experimental philosophy could resemble philosophy by opinion poll. But that is not its goal or method. Rather, the view is that before relying on ordinary intuitions, philosophers should check what non-philosophers actually believe. That is, if philosophical theories depend on a certain view of intuitions, then philosophers should begin with the empirically accurate view. They should make sure that when they say the public thinks X, that the public does think X. The promise of philosophy is that experimental philosophy has the potential to make social and political philosophy more scientific. This does not deprive philosophers of the freedom to construct theories that explain why ordinary intuitions are incorrect, insofar as they are complex judgments and not mere expressions of taste. Recent work in experimental philosophy includes Joshua Knobe and Sean Nichols. Experimental Philosophy, 2008, Joshua Knobe, Intentional Action in Folk Psychology. An Experimental Investigation, in Philosophical Psychology, 16, 2003, N.K. Anthony Appiah, Experiments in Ethics, 2008. Critical responses to experimental philosophy include, Ernest Sosa. Experimental Philosophy and Philosophical Intuition, in Philosophical Studies. 132, 2006, Kirk Ludwig, The Epistemology of Thought Experiments, 1st vs. Third-Person Approaches, in Midwest Studies in Philosophy, 31, 2007, and Antti Kopinen. The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy, in Philosophical Explorations, 10, 2007.
How is environmentalism related to racial and international studies?
Theorists of racial discrimination such as Laura Westra and Bill E. Lawson have identified environmental racisms. Minorities, who live in poor neighborhoods, are more vulnerable to having toxic dump sites in their immediate environments, for example. Some indigenous philosophers have criticized the whole Western technological project. By contrast, international scholars have criticized Western environmentalists for assuming that development in poor countries for the improvement of human life is less important than the preservation of nature.
What was Bacon's influence?
Francis Bacon's, 1561–1626, requirements for causal explanations were universally accepted as the basic principles of methodology in the new science. In the 19th century, the empiricist philosopher John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873, restated them as the basis of scientific investigation in his time. Bacon's aspirations for an association of scientists were eventually realized in the British Royal Society. Bacon's methodological principles, combined with Kepler's theory of elliptical orbits, were built on by Isaac Newton, 1643–1727. For his culminating scientific system of the fundamental structure and operating laws of the universe. And Newton's work was to hold at least until Albert Einstein's 1879–1955, theories in the early 20th century.
What is property?
(1840), he famously proclaimed that property is theft.
Who was René Descartes?
René Descartes, 1596–1650, inaugurated modern philosophy with a pair of questions that persist to this day. How are mind and matter different? And how is the mind connected to the body? He did not set out to invent these questions, but encountered them himself while on the way toward trying to do something else. He was trying to prove to the Catholic Church that rigorous philosophy was compatible with religion and that science could be both certain and compatible with religion.
Who was Ernest Nagel?
Born in Czechoslovakia, Ernest Nagel, 1901–1985. Lived in the United States after 1910 and was a member of the Columbia University Philosophy Department for over 40 years. His The Structure of Science, 1961. Is probably the last important logical positivist account of scientific investigation. Nagel extended the principles of the covering law model, whereby explanation is based on a generalization that has been inductively built up, for the social sciences. He argued that although historical events are unique and non-recurring, historical explanation implies that such events would happen again, given the same conditions and proven generalizations.
What aspects of Dostoevsky's life influenced his deep interest in human difficulty?
Dostoevsky's father was a violent and abusive alcoholic. He was also the doctor of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor in Moscow. Dostoevsky himself suffered from epilepsy from the age of 9. As a child, he used to disobey his parents and explore Mariinsky Hospital. Absorbed by the misery of the patients and the stories about their lives that they told him. His first book, Poor Folk, 1846, brought out the individual humanity of the poor, who were otherwise be ignored and dismissed by the educated reading public of the time. In 1849 Dostoevsky was arrested for his participation in the liberal group of intellectuals called the Petrashevsky Circle. He was sentenced to death. Although Tsar Nicholas II did not really intend for the execution to be carried out. Nevertheless, the experience of standing for hours in the freezing cold in anticipation of a firing squad was believed to have scared Dostoevsky for life. He was then exiled to Siberia for 4 years of hard labor. He wrote of this period, in summer, intolerable closeness, in winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten. Filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. When Dostoevsky's brother and wife died in the same year, he fell into a deep depression and became a gambler. During that period he wrote Crime and Punishment, 1866, in a frenzied haste, because he was out of money. His life evened out after 1867, when he married his 20-year-old stenographer to whom he had dictated The Gambler, 1867. While this book is about an elderly woman who gambles self-destructively, some think that Dostoevsky was describing his own compulsion. Dostoevsky lived at the Russian resort Staraya for years before his death, from emphysema and an epileptic seizure that brought on a lung hemorrhage. 40,000 people went to his funeral.
What is ethical naturalism?
Ethical naturalism holds that goodness is a natural property and that morality can be understood without intuitions, conscience, or religion.
What was Auguste Comte's positivism?
Comte advocated the use of mathematics for making decisions in ways that still influence statistics and business models today. He believed that our knowledge all comes from observation and asserted that it was impossible to know anything about physical objects that could not be observed. The goal of science was prediction, said Comte, and explanation has the same structure as prediction. He meant by this that a theory that generates predictions about what will happen can also explain what has happened. For example, suppose our theory is that friction, oxygen, and combustible material will cause fire. From this we can predict that striking a match will result in a flame. And we can also explain why striking the match causes the flame. Comte also thought that imagination should always be kept in check by observation.
What did Émile Durkheim contribute to the study of suicide?
First of all, Durkheim defined suicide as follows. He term suicide is applied to all cases of death resulting directly or indirectly from a positive or negative act of the victim himself, which he knows will produce this result. Second, he systematically catalogued suicide rates in modern society and analyzed his data into four main types: egoistic, altruistic, anomic, and fatalistic. Egoistic suicide resulted from insufficient social ties. Altruistic from too much involvement in social relationships. Anomic suicide was the result of acute or chronic crises typical of conditions in contemporary life, especially economic deprivation. Fatalistic suicide occurred only in exceptional conditions of difficult life circumstances, such as slavery.
What was Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of a gay science?
In a series of aphorisms, Nietzsche advocates philosophy as a celebration of life, in contrast to the stultified and stultifying practices of the German intellectuals, whom he had criticized as Philistines throughout his writings during the 1870s. He caps his scientific ideals with the cosmological and possibly Neoplatonistic doctrine of life as a cycle, which he calls the eternal recurrence. Everyone's life recurs an endless number of times, and the test of a life worth living is that every moment one can will the infinite return of that moment in some future life, and do so with joy. Nietzsche applauded the ideal of the most high-spirited, alive, and world-affirming human being who has not only come to terms and learned to get along with whatever was and is, but who wants to have what was and is repeated into all eternity. And although he thought that we eternally recur, built into what happens again and again is continuous choice, in a chance spectacle of endless opportunity. In form, this perspective is a reenactment by Nietzsche of the birth of tragedy, with the forces of high spirit and reason affirming the worst that has, can, and will happen.
Who was Harriet Taylor?
Harriet Taylor, 1807 to 1858, was John Stuart Mill's wife. He met her when he was 25, while still recovering from his nervous breakdown. She had been married since the age of 18 to John Taylor, with whom she had 3 sons. Mill and Harriet Taylor had what they described as a platonic relationship, until the death of her husband after 20 years of marriage. At one point, the Taylors separated, with Harriet taking her daughter to live with her, while John raised their sons. Some feminist writers believe that Harriet was actually the author of Mill's The Subjection of Women. 1869, as well as other writings, such as On Liberty, 1859, for which Mill gave her great credit. Taylor's contemporary detractors referred to her as that stupid woman, and said she only appeared to have been Mill's collaborator because she was adept at repeating what he had already said or written. Taylor published very little in her own name. She was a founding member of the Kensington Society, which circulated the first petition for the rights of women. And she contributed articles to the Unitarian Journal, monthly repository. Mill was without question extremely devoted to her, and after her death he wrote, "Were I but capable of interpreting to the world one half the great thoughts and noble feelings which are buried in her grave, I should be the medium of a greater benefit to it than is ever likely to arise from anything that I can write, unprompted and unassisted by her all but unrivaled wisdom."
What was Friedrich Schelling's major thesis?
Schelling believed that the entirety of nature, physical as well as mental, was mind on the way toward consciousness. But consciousness, or the human self, is the creator of nature. Life cannot be explained in mechanistic or inert terms. Schelling resurrected a type of alchemical thought whereby magnetism, which is the general form of particular existence, either becomes evident in light or maleness, or else becomes evident in heavy inertia, or femaleness. In ordinary language, although there was nothing ordinary about this belief, the alchemists believed that things that exist are all made up of a magnetic something that can manifest itself in either lightweight and airy, or male, beings, or else in heavy and dense, or female, beings. He believed that existent reality became separated from the absolute in a spontaneous act of freedom, which created time itself, along with the world as we know it. That is, there occurred in the absolute a spontaneous burst of freedom that resulted in the separation of what we perceive as reality from the absolute. Another consequence was the appearance of time. This is to say that the absolute exists outside of time. Schelling had a following among romantics in the sciences, as well as in the arts, because romantics in the 19th century, as today, loved quasi-mystical explanations of the world. Laurence Ockham, 1774 to 1851, for example, postulated that all of life in Schelling's sense, in which nature is unconscious mind, originated in primeval slime. The connection between Oken's idea and Schelling's thought is not at all clear, except to indicate how one wild set of ideas is capable of inspiring others.
What were Grotius' influential ideas about natural law?
Hugo Grotius, in Dutch, Huig de Groot 1583 to 1645, modified natural law from a prescription for the common good to a doctrine restraining what individuals were permitted to do in pursing their own separate goods. That is, he changed Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, notion of natural law from a communal idea to an individualistic one. This line of thought was highly influential for the political philosophy developed by both Thomas Hobbes 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704. According to Grotius in the Law of War and Peace, 1626. Natural law could be used to settle religious disputes, as well as international ones. Grotius thought that natural law could be known by observing human nature. He concluded that humans are both sociable and combative, and that every person has rights that limit what others can do. Government is the result of sacrificing some rights so that our lives will improve. Grotius thought that we would be obligated to obey natural law if God did not exist. Although he also thought that God does enforce natural law. Both Hobbes and Locke constructed theories of just and useful government. Beginning from foundations of natural law. However, Hobbes emphasized the combative aspects of human nature, whereas Locke emphasized the sociable side.
How were Joseph Marie de Maistre ideas similar to Edmund Burke's?
Joseph Marie de Maistre, 1753 to 1821, was a Roman Catholic political theorist who sought to restore traditional society according to Thomism, the teachings of Thomas Aquinas c. 1225 to 1274, he viewed the French Revolution as satanic, in his 1796 Considerations on France. However, de Maistre went beyond Burke in his belief that the Catholic Church would triumph over Enlightenment philosophy. In his 1810 essay on the generating principle of political constitutions, he described a fundamental human and God-ordained desire for order and discipline.
What is the story behind Friedrich Schelling's scandalous romantic affair with August Wilhelm von Schlegel's wife?
When he was teaching in Jena, Schelling was close friends with German poet August Wilhelm von Schlegel, who was highly esteemed by other German romantics, and with Caroline, who would later be the poet's wife. There was discussion of marriage between Schelling and the Schlegel's daughter, Augusta. But Augusta died from dysentery in 1800, after Schelling had supervised her treatment. At first, Schelling was blamed. But later biographers exonerated him because her death was probably medically inevitable at that time. Schelling and Caroline then recognized their love for each other. And August moved out, leaving Jena for Berlin. Later, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, another famous literary figure, helped secure a divorce. And Schelling and Caroline married, after they had left Jena to avoid the predictable scandal.
How did Descartes solve his evil demon hypothesis?
René Descartes recounted everything that he could doubt: sensory information, the external world, his own thought processes, and the goodness of God, and noted that one thing he could not doubt was that he himself was doing the doubting. From this he concluded that he could not doubt that he existed. Since someone or something must be doing the doubting. He wrote later about his famous cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. I noticed that while I was trying to think everything false, it must needs be that I, who was thinking this, was something. And observing that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so solid and secure that the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics could not overthrow it. I judged that I need not scruple to accept it as the first principle of the philosophy that I was seeking.
Who was Hans Reichenbach?
Hans Reichenbach, 1891–1953, was the leader of logical empiricism. He was born in Hamburg and studied mathematics, physics, logic, and philosophy. He became a professor of philosophy of science at the University of Berlin and was a close associate of Albert Einstein. He founded Erkenntnis with Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, which was the premier journal of scientific philosophy in the 1930s. As with thousands of other Jews at the time, Reichenbach had to leave Germany in 1933. He first went to Istanbul before settling down at the University of California at Los Angeles. His main works include Experience and Prediction, 1938, The Theory of Probability, 1939–1949, and the posthumous The Direction of Time, 1956.
What are the modules of the mind, according to Jerry Fodor?
In his The Modularity of Mind, 1983, Fodor posits transducers, senses that connect us with the outside world, input systems, and central systems. Input and central systems are distinguished by the fact that input systems are modular and central systems are not. Modules each have one kind of cognitive material, for example, the visual module. And their information is encapsulated so that they can work very quickly, although they are inaccessible to conscious introspection. One module can be destroyed without impairing the others, as in cases of aphasia. Besides the different sensory systems, language is a module. It should be noted that Fodor does not hesitate to compare his theory with the system of phrenology propounded by Franz Joseph Gall. 1758 to 1828, which is usually taken to be an example of early pseudoscience. The non-modular central systems correspond to thinking and believing and have access to other contents of the mind. Unlike language, the non-modular central system is not localized.
What is the origin of materialism, Marxism, and anarchism in the modern era?
Intellectually, they were all reactions against Hegelianism. In society, as political movements, they represented a natural historical progression from the French Revolution and a reaction against the Industrial Revolution in Europe, as well as against feudalism in Russia.
What was Sigmund Freud's Oedipal theory?
The Oedipal theory, or Freud's idea of the Oedipus complex, was based on Freud's instinct theory that there are enduring sexual desires in the human psyche, as well as opposition to their expression. Sexuality and its opposition take the form of libido versus ego, or self-preservation in early and middle life, and the form of eros, or desiring life, versus thanatos, or a wish to die, toward the end. It's interesting that Freud thought the wish to die was a human expression of a longing in all life to return to an inorganic state. The Oedipus complex results from a situation in which the child desires the mother as a result of prolonged human dependency on one caregiver. Male children fear that their fathers will punish them through castration. Female children transfer their original Oedipal yearnings for their mothers to their fathers in an Electra complex, which is also accompanied by penis envy. This all occurs unconsciously in terms of active and passive principles that later come to be expressed and identified as male and female, respectively. Because the primary process of the psyche tends toward a cathartic discharge of repressed energy. The pleasure principle is Freud's main explanatory tool. He applied this principle to the way in which the emergence of unconscious material can account for humor and also everyday failures in function and memory. In psychoanalysis, both dreams and free association could be used to access unconscious conflicts and particularly Oedipal fantasies.
Did Malebranche have a more extensive philosophy to support his theory of causation?
Yes, Malebranche was highly regarded as a theological metaphysician. In his major book, The Search After Truth, 1674, he developed his theory of vision in God. Malebranche agreed with René Descartes, 1596–1650, that ideas in the mind are the basic units of perception and knowledge. But he argued that our ideas are actually in God, rather than in us. This vision in God was especially important for abstract knowledge, according to Malebranche. Because universals, mathematical truths, and moral understanding were part of the vision in God. As such, they reflected God's knowledge of what was eternally true about the world he had created. In his treatise on Nature and Grace, 1680, Malebranche provided an explanation of how God's goodness, omnipotence, and omniscience could allow evil in the world. He claimed that God could have created a more perfect world without the known evils of the present one. This more or mostly perfect world, however, would have been more complicated than the world God did create. And creating that world would have contradicted God's principle of acting in the simplest possible way, according to general laws. This simplicity and generality could also explain the unequal distribution of grace among human beings.
What was Friedrich Hegel's system?
Knowledge, according to Hegel, begins with logic, the subject of which is pure being. Although logic is always mediated in history, so that we do not see or experience logic in its pure form, but have to infer it from relations among events. Past philosophy represents different forms of consciousness that have progressed toward absolute knowledge or philosophical science. The progression of consciousness occurs because different forms of consciousness are contradictory and their inner dialectic resolves the contradictions via the emergence of new forms. This dialectic is not a dialogue between consciousnesses, but the inner development of what consciousness is conscious of. Hegel is able to chronicle this development of consciousness toward absolute knowledge, because it is presumed to be attained through his philosophical work.
What are some examples of the perplexities Maimonides set out in his Guide of the Perplexed?
First, and perhaps foremost, was the question posed in Guide of the Perplexed of what kind of knowledge it is possible for people to have of God. According to the doctrine of negative theology, which Maimonides took over from Avicenna. 980-1037, nothing positive can be known about God. Because God has nothing in common with any other being experienced by humans, and humans have no experience of God. All that we can know is what God is not. Negative theology is the doctrine that God cannot be known by man. Second, there is a contradiction between the idea of God on which Judaism is founded and the philosophical, Aristotelian idea of God. The philosophical idea is that God is intellect, whereas the religious idea is that it cannot be known what God is. Maimonides, 1135–1204. Sums up this problem with what he calls very disgraceful conclusions in the following passage. Namely, it would follow that the deity, whom everyone who is intelligent recognizes to be perfect in every kind of perfection, could, as far as all beings are concerned, produce nothing new in any of them. If he wished to lengthen a fly's wing or shorten a worm's foot, he would not be able to do so. But Aristotle would say that he would not wish it and that it is impossible to will something different from what is, that it would not add to his perfection, but would perhaps from a certain point of view be a deficiency. Third, Maimonides rejected the Aristotelian doctrine of the eternity of the world. Although he could offer no conclusive rational justification for this rejection, neither did he affirm that this was an issue in which religion was definitively correct.
Who were the important philosophers of Middle Stoicism?
Middle Stoicism matured in Rhodes, with Painetius, c. 185–110 BCE, and Posidonius, c. 125–50 BCE. Both of whom influenced the statesman and writer Cicero, 106–43 BCE. Posidonius, c. 125–50 BCE. Incorporated both Platonic and Aristotelian ideas into his views. The main accomplishment of Middle Stoicism was to apply Greek ideas to military and political life in Roman culture. Middle Stoicism was generally more focused on how those who were Stoics could weather specific life problems, such as defeat in war, or imprisonment.
What needed to be reconciled between Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn?
Karl Popper, 1902–1994, claimed that scientists ought to change their theories when they were falsified, and that the hallmark of a scientific theory was its ability to be falsified. Thomas Kuhn, 1922–1996, believed that, in fact, many accepted scientific theories had plenty of known, falsifying data. The problem was that Kuhn's account did not allow for progress in science. According to Popper's criterion of falsification, and that Popper's theory seemed to be unrealistic.
What was Karl Popper's contribution to philosophy of science?
In his The Logic of Scientific Discovery, 1935, English translation, 1959. Popper, 1902–1994, attacked the logical positivist assumption that scientific hypotheses could be derived from experience and confirmed by it inductively. Popper claimed that hypotheses can never be completely confirmed because we can't know what the future will hold with certainty, or even with high probability. It requires an unspecifiably high number of positive instances to confirm a hypothesis and only one negative case to falsify or discredit it. Popper's theory of falsification was very well received by working scientists.
How is environmentalism related to feminism?
Feminists have addressed the exploitation of natural environments as part of overall cultural misogyny insofar as the earth is at least metaphorically female. Also, some of the exploitation of animals is centered on female animals. Chris Cuomo explores this last thesis and characterizes living beings in an interesting way as having dynamic charm in feminism and ecological communities, 2002.
What are the main themes and influences in philosophy of technology?
Most of the writing is on the progressive/environmentalist/feminist/postmodern side of contemporary philosophy. While not anti-technology per se, there is a deep suspicion of technology as a force in its own right that stems from Martin Heidegger's, 1889 to 1976, The Question Concerning Technology. By contrast, more optimistic views of technology stem from the writings of John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Key issues are, whether technology can be controlled independently of radical economic and political changes, whether technology can correct its own excesses, and the roles played by technology in the history of science. Contemporary books of interest include, Michael Adass, Machines as the Measure of Men. Science, Technology, and Ideologies of Western Dominance, 1990, Eric Higgs Anthology Technology and the Good Life. 2000, and Hans Achterhues, American Philosophy of Technology, 2001.
Did Aristotle think that morality had a purpose or final cause?
Yes. Aristotle thought that in human life as in nature, generally everything has a purpose and there cannot be an infinite regress of purposes. That is, there is an unmoved mover, because we are goal-directed. There must be some goal that is valuable to us in itself, and not because it will lead to some other goal. The goal that is good in and of itself is happiness. Aristotle thought that happiness is not pleasure or any other feeling, but a quality that settles over life when we are actualizing our essence by behaving virtuously for the right reasons. Our essence is our rationality.
Was there only one kind of religious life for Søren Kierkegaard?
No, Kierkegaard distinguished between two. In the first, the individual relates to God, using his idea of God to deal with guilt. In the second, there is a teleological suspension of the ethical, as in the story of Abraham and Isaac. The implication of this transcendence of the ethical is that real religion is higher and more important than what is accepted as goodness in society.
What did Maurice Merleau-Ponty mean by a phenomenology of perception?
Merleau-Ponty opposed the abstract natures of both empiricism, which generalized, and idealism, which denied the direct experience and existence of physical reality. He proclaimed that the perceiving mind is an incarnate mind, meaning that it was in the body in the sense of being coincident with the body. Perception is a physical process involving eyes, ears, the nose, the hands, rather than only the mind. His focus was thus on the human body as a perceiving, living part of world. A position theretofore much neglected in philosophical inquiry. According to Merleau-Ponty, perception is neither abstract nor scientific. Rather, all perception is lived, it is the experience of human beings in the world. Consciousness is, to use a later term, embodied and always engaged in perceiving the world. What is phenomenological about human experience is that what is perceived cannot be separated from how it is perceived or from how it is described. In conversation with Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857–1913, Merleau-Ponty composed the prose of the world. 1969, claiming that meaning is not determined by history but by the subject's actual experience in the world. Language is itself continually changing as a result of this experience. In The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty had intended to show how communication and thought can go beyond perception, but he died before completing that project.
What did Henri Bergson have to say about laughter and the human sense of humor?
Bergson wrote a 1900 analysis of laughter, which shows he was pretty interested in the concept of humor. He thought that the comical is a part of life that cannot be fully understood by reason alone. Laughter requires a state of indifference, according to Bergson. For laughter has no greater foe than emotion. He went on to say that the comic demands something like a momentary anesthesia of the heart. It's appeal is to intelligence pure and simple. To be comical, something must be rigid, like a facial grimace or a mechanical walk. Our perception of this rigidity is broken up by our laughter. Ordinary language bears Bergson out on this because we talk about being cracked up or broken up when something is funny. Anything that switches our attention from the soul or moral realm to the body can be comical. Said Bergson, for example, a speaker sneezing at a dramatic moment in his presentation. Bergson saw the overall purpose of comedy as a reassertion of life in an age of machines.
Who was Bertrand Russell?
Arthur William Bertrand III Earl Russell, 1872–1970, who was known to his friends as Bertie, is hailed as the founder of analytic philosophy, along with G. E. Moore, 1873–1958, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889–1951. He studied and lectured at Cambridge University, losing his position there between 1916 and 1944 because of his pacifist views and activism. He won the Nobel Prize in 1950. His writings on philosophical, political, scientific, and social reform topics are all in beautifully executed prose, which he was said to have been able to compose from the first draft. Russell is now best known for his failed attempt with Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947, to reduce mathematics to logic. His theory of descriptions, his theory of types, and his ruling doctrine that the work of philosophy is to analyze propositions, the meanings of sentences, and that the only propositions worthy of such analysis must have constituents with which we are acquainted, have direct knowledge of. Russell was one of the most productive philosophical authors of all time. He published hundreds of articles and essays and scores of books. Among the most noteworthy are On Denoting Mind, Volume 14, 1905, Philosophical Essays, 1910, The Problems of Philosophy, 1912, Principia Mathematica. With Alfred North Whitehead, 3 volumes, 1910–1913, Why I Am Not a Christian, 1927. A History of Western Philosophy and its Connection with Political and Social Circumstances from the Earliest Times to the Present Day, 1946, and The Autobiography of Bertrand Russell, 1967–1969.